Yo, yo, we are back once again. Another episode of When the Needle Drops, the pod that brings you the in depth, uncut, uncensored interviews with some of the most influential people in the music scene. And today, my guest, radio royalty, is what I would call this man. Used to be for Capital FM, now you can hear him on your way home from work each and every night with his partner in crime, Stephen Mill, on Clyde One. Mr. Garry Spence, how are you, Gary?
I'm not bad. I see you've started drinking earlier in the day. Radio royalty. Come
Oh,
on.
mate,
We well to go yet.
I think you're doing yourself a disservice. I mean, don't get me wrong, we did try to get George Bowie, but we got the next best thing.
Listen, I made a career at Capital out of taking bookings Des couldn't do, and I do the same now at Clyde with George. So I'm not proud. Money's money.
Absolutely, mate, absolutely. So Gary, what we'll do is we'll go back, we'll go through your career. Obviously, it's been an exceptional career that you've had within music, and then obviously progressing onto the radio show. Born and bred in Inverness, how was life for you growing up? What was your first roads into music?
Weirdly enough, I'm speaking to you right now from the first studio I ever did a show in. So MFR is the Clyde One of the North for Glasgow listeners, Glasgow viewers, and it's the big local radio station.
Okay.
So my granny literally lived, before she died, she lived about 20 metres that way. So like most kids in Scotland, your mum's out doing extra jobs, spent most weekends with her. And it was something as random as the radio station were applying for planning permission to get a car park extended.
Mhm.
So to get all the residents, because it's a residential area, up in the hills looking over Inverness, to get the planning permission, they decided to sweeten the locals by inviting them to some summer barbecue. So I obviously was there. My grannies went down and just did the cliche way in as it was back then. How old are you, Maka?
I'm 34, mate. I know I don't look 34, but I am still
That's why
34.
I asked. But do you remember what a fax machine is?
Yeah, vaguely.
Jesus, God. Not even Maka remembers what a fax machine is.
Vaguely. I mean, email's probably more
Yeah.
my starting point.
So as I go in and do talks to schools and media students, I find that the language is making me sound more and more prehistoric as time goes on. But anyway, I would sit out in that office there with next to the fax machine, waiting for the Shinty results. Massive scene up here, of course. And just that cliche way in, I was making tea, I was making coffee, I was a pain in the arse. I was here from dusk till dawn every single weekend. This was my second home.
Yeah.
And I just helped out and helped out and helped out. And then eventually, when I was 14, got a nighttime show once a week, and then got a couple of weekend shows. And then when I was 16, started doing sort of semi full time, if you like, couple of evenings, couple of weekends. And then when I was 18, I signed my first full time contract. I was still in school. It was one of those, sign the contract, goes in a drawer for a few months.
Till you're legalized age of what we can bring that back out the drawer.
That's it. And then I started my first full time job on air doing afternoons in 2001, the week after I left school. So
And this was with FM. This was MFR.
MFR, yeah. So it was the local station. It was before any networking, before stations joined up. We were all owned by the same people, but it was a completely different scene. I mean, I can't move the camera, but I'm surrounded by touchscreens right now. When I first started out, it was CD players, and not just any old CD players. You put the CD player into this cartridge and you put it in. They were really common in radio stations. And it was just a wildly different time. But I started then, and I was also doing club gigs in Aberdeen. I was doing them in Inverness. Again, I sound like I'm making this up. I used to have to have my lunch in school when my mates would take a wander down to the kebab house in town because we had our uniforms on, and I'd lied about my age to get my first club gig in Inverness, and I was worried I'd bump into the management. So I got in really, really young by telling a lot of lies, basically.
As you do, and that's exactly it. People do, lie, little white lies to try and get things early.
Yeah.
And it's just one of the things. I thought that was a Glasgow thing, but it appears it's Scottish.
Oh no, bullshit is universal, Maka.
Yeah.
But I just the minute I sat in a studio, I just thought, and I'm sure you've had this, I'm sure lots of our colleagues have had, whether it's in a club, whether it's in your room on decks or in a radio studio for me, because that was always my bread and butter, always will be.
Mhm.
But I just immediately had that, this is for me. This is all I'm going to do. This is all I want to do. If I can make a career out of it, great. At the best, it'll be a hobby. And at the start, and this is what I say to anyone wanting to get in, I was just getting my hours up. I did more shows off air in 2 years than I did on air, because you were in the spare studio, you were doing them as live, you were doing proper trial runs, you'd take the news, you'd do this and that. And that's something that I still do. I do a Sunday Mail column, which was this weird sort of ambition I had as a kid, because we always had the Sunday Mail in the house. And before I got it, I wrote to the editor and said, I'm going to send you a column every single week.
Until you put me in the paper.
And I just said, there might be nothing at the end of it. You might not have anything going, but I'm going to send it every single week. And honestly, and this was about 6 years ago, because there was still that thing, that ambition I had, that was to get a newspaper column. Even when I was on holiday with my wife and my twins, who were young at the time, be in the hotel room, like filing, going, shit, I've not done my column. And Ruth's like, it's not going out. I was like, no, but they need to see that work ethic. They need to see that graft. They need to see that you mean business. And again, that's everything that I say to anyone coming through now. You just need to show the hunger, because they'd far rather have somebody that they want to try and, sort of clip the balls off a wee bit, if you like, keep in a box, than just sort of, wonder if they actually care or want it that badly.
Yeah,
and that was me 25 years into my career. That's, you've got to be prepared. If you're going into a different thing, like for me was the newspapers, you've got to be prepared to start from scratch.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I mean, I was down Clyde for 6 weeks doing the course with Gavin, and that's they told us the same thing. There is a graft that you've got to show that you care. And he told a story about I don't know who the colleague was, but he'd stayed late one night to help out, and he'd seen that the commitment that was involved in that, and it obviously stood him in high stead, because people take notice of these things. And I think I've annoyed Ellen and George every day since. I even had a go at Vic. I've had a moan at everybody. Yeah. Well, I know that now. I've had a moan at everybody to try and No,
but that's what you do. There's that old cliche that they say when you're going for a job. If you're going for a job interview, say in a traditional job, an office-based job, always make friends with the receptionist. Always be nice to them, because that's your first impression. But in the media, someone like Gav Pearson, for anyone who doesn't know, he's a Clyde legend, and he does as much behind the scenes as he's done on air, and he's been part of the daytime lineups for you. He's very much the patriarch of the station in lots of ways, for someone who's not on full time.
Yep.
And somebody like him, who's obviously quite influential, seeing that graft, seeing that passion, the minute you're inside that radio station, you just want to look hungry,
Yeah, of course.
Because it's a tough business. It's really tough, and if you need to want it that much.
I know that now. I was a wee bit. I thought I would probably say I was a bit naive when I started thinking about it, and now I see the graft and the commitment that you guys put in. It is second to none. You had touched there.
I love how you talked about that graft as I sit back with a coffee.
But this is off the cuff, mate. As I say, it's always uncut and uncensored. This is where you guys like yourself can come on and just chat away and basically chat shit, and let's hear the stories. But you touched on doing gigs in Aberdeen. What kind of clubs were you doing there? What kind of music were you playing when you were doing these gigs?
So I was always unashamedly commercial. I've got specialist tastes. I was very, very into house. French house was huge for a few years, to me anyway. I've never been a techno guy, never ever been a techno guy. I was always into sort of funky, soulful, sort of uplifting house, if you like. And that was going to be a longer game, and I really wanted to make money. So I went through to Aberdeen, because I was doing weekend shows on North Sound 1, which is the MFR of Aberdeen, the Clyde one of Aberdeen. And it was a huge step up. So I got Sunday breakfast. And again, I told lies to get into a venue there. I forget what it was called now, because Aberdeen, as anyone over a certain age knows, was the Newcastle of Scotland. The nightlife was, Glasgow didn't get a look in.
Right.
And I did a couple of gigs there. And as a result, they were one-offs. I was covering for someone. So very commercial. It was like a pre-bar, And then I used that to bullshit my way into a gig in Inverness, which became my first residency. I was doing like a Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday night at Beck's in Inverness, which was like a party bar cum club. And again, I was sweating my death. I was scared to speak on the mic. I only had half a I remember we had the big flight cases. I only had half a flight case full of CDs, and I was, shit myself. But you had to do it. You get your hours up. And the money, I mean, I think doing 8:30 on a Saturday night until 1:30 in the morning, the licenses were pretty strict back then in Inverness. Although as a DJ, I prefer it. We'll talk about that later. But
Yeah.
I've done Livingston till 4 a.m. It's not fun.
No, it's
But
not.
and it's not from a work ethic point of view. It's just 3 till 4 in the morning. It's just some zombies walking about, and
Yeah.
that's nothing against Livingston. That would be the case anyway.
I know
But
that feeling.
So I was doing very commercial stuff, got into Beck's bar, but I really loved my music. I just didn't get to play the stuff I like in gigs. And that was a business decision because when I went down to England for a few years, we bought this dance radio station in England, the company I worked for. And it was a massive station. It covered like 4 counties, Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk. And, I thought before I moved down there, Norfolk, Norwich, Farmers, it's so cosmopolitan. And they had a deal with Luminar where they'd go out and do a thing called Vibe Live every Friday night. And I would DJ at them. So you're live on the radio, which I've always hated because you understand what processing is.
Yeah.
Radio station processing. If you've got a mix that's a little bit out, that will be, highlighted, tenfold on air.
Absolutely.
So I would take all these bookings. Luminar clubs, obviously, like your Liquid, your Attics, big commercial. You push it a little bit tougher. I remember Peterborough did Liquid and they liked it a little bit more banging and that was great. But it was always, I've never been a music snob. I've always been very much like, I had a mate called Rick who was a house DJ and just a brilliant DJ. He'd do all the cool clubs. And he used to say to me, because he was on the radio at the weekends there, and he'd say, Jesus Christ, I can't take these bookings because I can't be seen or heard to play what you're playing. Whereas I'm just like, show me the money. I will do the Hippodrome Colchester, and I'll play every big commercial crossover dance song there is. And I loved it, I played some insane venues down there. And again, I was just getting my hours up, just doing more and more and more. And so that's always been my thing. I've always been very commercial, commercial dance. But I followed that rather than going down a specialist route. It also keeps, for someone who listens to music every single day, it keeps your love of music alive because the stuff that I play is not the stuff that I would choose to listen to. And if those two things were the same and you're doing that full time, sometimes I'm sure you're the same, Maka. You come home from a gig and you put on 5 Live or you put on whatever it is, you'll put on Radio 4 just because you can't listen to any more music.
Yeah, I think my big vice, and I say vice, it's not really a vice, but if I'm coming home in the car from a gig, after playing, what we play, so after coming home, I put smooth radio on because it takes me to,
a calmer place.
It ranges from the 70s to just now, but it's nice and settled and it's calm and it settles your eardrums.
I tell you what it is, Maka. It's your relaxing music mix. I think there's a tagline in there somewhere. But my vice is at Hart Hill Services when you get that M&S and you're just like, all the sausage rolls, all the Mars bar duos.
Exactly. No, I think Hart Hill must be the most famous services for people coming home from gigs. Either way, either side.
But I don't know about you. When I'm finished a gig, I'm just so spent, and because I've got the radio during the week, and I'm looking forward to just nothingness the next day. I bumped into a couple of DJs at Hart Hill, and there's one in Edinburgh. And they're, because it's still their passion. I don't mean it's not my passion, but because they've got to the weekend and it's like, yes, we're doing gigs. And I've always loved the gigs I've done, especially I've got a club I do in Edinburgh. I've got one I do in Glasgow. I've got one I do in each city. Yeah. And I've cut back, and obviously the pandemic cut us all back. But when I go and I bump into them after gigs, they're bouncing about, Garry, how you doing? I'm just like, I just want to I don't want to speak to anyone. I don't want to listen to anyone. My brain is fried.
Please leave me alone.
Yeah, I know, but not because I don't want to see them, just because.
I know. I share your sentiments, and I know how you feel with regards to that. What kind of era would that have been when you were down south? Would that be kind of?
So I was here in Inverness till 2003. After Beck's, I got a gig in the big club, if you like. Inverness is the size of place. Like, I did a gig in Paisley recently, and it was like 900 people on a Saturday night. That doesn't happen anymore. I would do Lorenzo's in Dunfermline, 900 people on a Saturday night. Doesn't happen anymore. Yeah. I'm from that size of town where you had your big club and the neon lights and the manky carpet and all the rest of it. And so I got a gig in G's there, Mr. G's as it was called. So 80s and 90s. So I was gigging like hell. I mean, I was so shattered. I was gigging 4 nights a week. Also, when I was on the radio back up here, it was all free play. So, and that sounds great fun for an hour. These days, radio stations are programmed pretty strictly with music because it's almost mathematical. And there's all sorts of music teams that schedule music that, deal with record companies. Back then, doing a radio show was more of a gig. So I'd be in a club at night doing my 4th hour at 1 a.m. thinking, did I play that earlier in the gig or did I play that on the radio? So I'd totally burnt out. And then I had this opportunity to go down to England in 2003. So I was just about, I think I was about 20 years old. And then I was down in England for a few years, but the plan was always to come back up. It was for me anyway. And I knew I wanted to. Weirdly enough, because the Central Belt of Scotland's like the second biggest radio market in the UK, I had to go down south to basically, as I call it, earn your stripes. I say I call it. That's a very common phrase, Gary. But I went down there to get my hours up so eventually I could break back into Clyde, which almost happened a couple of times, then didn't. And then that's how I ended up on Capital.
So that when you came back up, was it always Glasgow that you were coming back to? You were never going back higher up. You were never going back to Inverness or anything.
No, God, no. Because again, it's that size of place where, how do I word this? I don't want to sound like a dick. I wanted to do it. I could only do so much in Inverness.
Yeah.
And I was quite ambitious. And I think that's my nature, regardless of whether it was radio or it was biochemistry. I wanted to get near the top. And if I couldn't, then I would just do something else. So Glasgow, weirdly enough, though, I from a young age, I was only ever going to live in three places. Inverness, which was my hometown. Edinburgh, because I had relatives there, and I always just thought Edinburgh was so much better than Glasgow. Now, let me finish before you come.
I was going to say that you're brave because people are going to jump down your throat with this.
Well, it'll come good, but Edinburgh I knew it better, and it didn't feel as intimidatingly big. And London, and the only reason I wanted to live in London was because I figured if I lived there, I must be on a big gig and doing well. Glasgow, for most people outside Glasgow, me and my wife talk about this a lot. Back in the day, you'd sit in Burger King overlooking George Square. Glasgow used to be the SECC, the airport, and Burger King at Queen Street Station. That's what Glasgow was to a lot of people outside Glasgow. So I ended up living there, and I cannot imagine living anywhere else. I love that my kids are Glaswegian, my wife's Glaswegian. I'd never pretend to be Glaswegian. Evidently, I'm not. And, I can say quite honestly, I would rather move to Scunthorpe than move to Edinburgh. I'm live from Edinburgh a couple of days a week. So our show is syndicated there, and that's one of our big stations. It's our big one next to Clyde. But yeah, it's just a lesson in life. I just always had these set idea, no, I'll never ever live in Glasgow. And I can't imagine living anywhere else. It's just the best city.
Yeah, I don't get me wrong. I've been Glaswegian all my life. It is. I don't. For me, Edinburgh's just a castle and some pandas. That's what it is, and the pandas aren't even that successful anymore either. So, so it's pretty much just now a castle. I think when tourists come, they take pictures of the castle and they come to Glasgow. That's just that. I think that's just a Glaswegian mentality, and I mean no disrespect to anybody from Edinburgh because I've got friends from Edinburgh, but I think that's just a Glaswegian mentality.
Do you know what? I've always been really honest about this. It's not just a Glasgow versus Edinburgh thing. People in Glasgow are different. They are. And now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes you hear that people make, that wouldn't happen anywhere else.
Yeah.
I'm like, bullshit. It would, 99.9 times out of 100 when someone says, oh, it could only happen to me, it could happen to anyone. But I've got my favorite story about the difference between Glasgow and anywhere else was I was looking for a flat, 2010 or something. So I was newly single. My folks were down weekends and that. And I was staying with a mate and I was about to look at a flat. So anyway, they were down visiting. We were in the village curry house and it was lunchtime and I was sitting there with my folks. My mum and my stepdad were sitting there, my wee brother, catching a bite to eat because they'd heard people rave about the village. My old man loves his curry. Mm-hmm. And we're sitting there one lunchtime and he's looking at the menu and he's like, see, they've got this wee special, but I don't quite know what that would be like. And this guy's like, yeah, try it, but I've got some. And he's like, no, you're like, yeah. And the guy's handing him a clean fork and saying, put your fork in my food. Now, to you, that might just be a normal thing. It's a nice thing. And he's obviously a very, very nice guy. That just would not happen in Inverness. That would not happen in Aberdeen. And again, before anyone comes at me from those cities, this is the problem with a syndicated radio show. See, when I'm on Clyde, and we'll talk about it in a bit, I do bits that are just for Clyde. I do bits that are just for Aberdeen. You're pressing a button, they go out. But see, when you're having to talk about all at once and compare, I'm just making enemies all over the place here. But in a nutshell, Glasgow was never, I told you I'd ramble. Glasgow was never part of the plan. And I'm so glad. I can't imagine living anywhere else. It's home.
Yeah, you're so glad you stumbled across Glasgow now.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just as well because that's where the media is based. So I wouldn't fancy that commute from Edinburgh every day.
No, I mean, I don't really fancy the commute for Cambuslang into the city centre, but it's just one of those things. So when you came back up, Gary, I know you had said that Clyde kind of sort of happened a couple of times, maybe for whatever reason, just
Yeah.
didn't quite happen. And then you moved to, was it? Did you go directly to Capital?
No, I didn't. So I came up. My girlfriend at the time was working in sponsorship promotions at the station we both worked for down south. So we just bought a flat as well down there. And she always knew I wanted to move back. That was always set out from the start. And she was keen to make a life in Scotland. So we we knew that if we were going to make the move, one of us had to be full time.
Mhm.
So anyway, she got a job at XFM, as was. So before Capital, it was Galaxy. Before Galaxy, it was XFM. Before XFM, it was Beat 106. And I was in talks. I'd lost my job through networking down there. So I was doing gigs in Essex. I was doing gigs in North London. Just again, just getting by, just gigging away and
Yeah.
doing the odd bit of radio work here and there. So I was in talks with Clyde for quite a bit with the program director then, and eventually I got an offer, which was to take over from Tiger Tim. So they called me and said,
It's big bits to fill.
"Oh God!" And this is why I wasn't devastated when it didn't happen. Still quite young anyway, but I was obviously aware of what a big gig that was to take
Yeah.
over. So that was it. My contract was written up, everything was happening, and I'd been up. I'd been covering Susie on Drive, doing a bit of cover here and there, and I was going to take over Tiger Tim. And then I get a phone call saying, "Right, the plans have changed. We've got someone else in mind for Tiger's show," who ended up being David Farrell, who's on STV now, was Romeo. He was like their in sort of house up and coming presenter, up and coming star, and they said, "We're going to put you straight onto daytime, 1 till 4 in the afternoon." And I was so relieved because even though the audience is bigger on daytime, like someone who's not Glaswegian taking over from Tiger Tim back
Yeah.
then, I've just like, I was shitting myself the minute they said
I
Tiger
can
Tim.
imagine.
I wasn't ready for it anyway, but I definitely, I'm the opposite act. I hate that word, but I'm the opposite act
Mhm.
to Tiger Tim. So that was great news. And then things very quickly changed and they had to go back to 4 hour shows. So Colin Kelly moved from news, I think, onto doing 10 till 2, and there was no gigs. So I was like, fine. But again, I was, when I found out, I wasn't devastated and I knew, well, it's obviously just not the right time,
Yeah.
which is good because you don't want to go getting pissed off, but you're not going to get anywhere with that. So, so I get a phone call a few months after this. This was summer 2007. It was around the time of John Smeaton, the airport attack. And they said, "Look, we'd like you to come and do overnights for 3 months and then we'll go straight onto daytime." And I said, "Fine. But could I have it in writing that it's only for 3 months?" Because, and I thought that was fair enough because I was moving with my girlfriend to a city neither of us knew, and I was going to be doing overnights. And I just thought I need to, it wasn't me saying, I wasn't making demands. If you're telling me that it's for 3 months, then presumably there's no
Yeah,
issue with that being right.
you're covering yourself to know that you're not making this commitment to come up, and in 3 months' time they go, well, actually, that's
Yeah.
not happening,
Anyway,
and then you're back to square one.
never heard another word from Clyde. So I was like, he's like, so I didn't go to Real Radio. I never approached them because they were very different to me. The whole Real was a bit older than me. It was it wasn't me, and I've always been sort of careful about. I would have taken a gig there a few years later, and
Mm-hmm.
happily. I mean, it was a juggernaut. It owned, it owned Clyde's arse for a good while. But I didn't approach them. I went to XFM, which was so far from my comfort zone. I mean, it was playing mostly rock, indie, and I was so out of my depth. But it would get me back on air. So I got weekends at XFM. So my girlfriend's working there during the week. We got a flat in Shawlands, and I'm doing weekend shifts. And it was, yeah, I'm not a football man, but I was doing a show on a Saturday afternoon, which my mates find hilarious, called, I think it was Rock. No, it wasn't Rock and Goal Saturday. It was something like that. Football Rocks, that was it. Football Rocks with Garry Spence. And I can laugh even thinking about it because I was so out of my depth with the playlist, the fucking football, everything. But, I was just like, it was survival. You had to keep this gig. So I did that for a few months. And if I'm totally honest, was sitting there thinking this station's going to be rebranded as Galaxy because it wasn't making money. It was a brilliant station, but it was a regional. It was just it was the wrong strategic move to turn it into XFM, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I just believed in my gut that it would be eventually rebranded. And it was. So I sat there on weekends, some really great people there, really nice people. And then it became Galaxy, and I got drive time. So I had to do lots of pilots, lots of demos. But for me, this was it. This was my, if it didn't happen now, I needed to go and do something else. So I got Galaxy drive time 4 till 7, started in November 2008. And it became Capital at some point. The audience figures grew, as they were always going to. You know, XFM was appealing to a very niche audience, whereas the minute Galaxy started playing back to back Kanye, you know, Britney and Pussycat Dolls, and you know, Eric Preds and Eric, it was you know what Galaxy was. It was a mainstream crossover dance R&B radio station. It was massive. It did some really cool stuff, and also back then, what helped was that Clyde was still chasing the real success and going a bit older as a result. So the market we were going for, 15 to 34, was just untapped. So that really, it was a great time. And then it rebranded as Capital. Had the happiest, I think it was 11 years I was on drive, the happiest time. Met my wife, had kids, was out doing gigs, you know, shattered, but just, it was just a really, really good time. Got nothing but fond memories of that radio station, whatever it was called when I was on it.
Yeah, forgive me for my ignorance, but the XFM, am I right in saying that the studios were down the back end of Ibrox?
Yeah, they were. Well, you made it sound worse than it is. That's nothing to do with Rangers or Ibrox. Yeah, they were in Govan. So they were in between the BBC and the STV building.
Yeah.
It's a building called Four Winds Pavilion. Such a cool building. It really was. There's a PR company in there now. And eventually we all moved into West Regent Street in the city centre, which is up on the 8th floor, and it's very plush and it looks great, state of the art. But Four Winds Pavilion, Pacific Quay, was a really cool building. Also, my friends who'd been there at Beat 106, like when I moved into XFM, when I went to work there was no Premier Inn, there was no Village Hotel, there was no BBC, or the BBC was just being built. But back in the day, apparently, when it was Beat 106, it was literally a dirt track and a horse and a carriage. There was no Squinty Bridge when it launched. You know, it was really out in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, that was a really special building for a lot of people. You'll know many of them. A lot of people in Scottish radio had some very enjoyable times in that building, and I think I was really lucky to be part of it.
So moving forward, the time at Capital comes to an end, and Garry Spence moves on to drive time on Clyde One.
I'd spoken to Clyde a couple of times over the years, and again, it's all in the timing, because I knew once I left Capital there was no going back, because it was that sort of, it's a younger audience. I was getting older as well. I was never insecure about getting older. I mean, I was so much happier in my 30s than I was in my 20s, but little words, like I wouldn't use the word wife on air, because I'd say my missus from other half, because you're aware. I was uncomfortable. I was never uncomfortable, but I was aware that I was getting towards the older end of the spectrum in terms of a Capital DJ. Yeah. So the plan and hope and ambition was always to get to Clyde and the wider network it was part of, but it was just the timing. So I'd spoken to him a couple of times. And then in 2019, we were all called into a meeting to be told the Global Radio were removing the breakfast shows. And that the legal requirement was only to have a drive show. And when you're on a station and you're there, whether or not they wanted you there, and they've obviously still got their drive show, and they're still doing really well. But it was just, long story short, it was the right time. I just felt the cards were shown, and I thought, right, I don't want to be here, even though I'm wanted as a legal requirement. And the deal with Clyde came around super quickly, really quickly, because they just got a new boss who I'd never met, probably one of the only people I'd never met in radio, who contacted me. I remember I was sitting dealing with a house insurance application in my living room, and I get this text from, because we've got lots of mutual friends, and her, Victoria, I'm talking about, her regional content directors I'm friendly with. So she got my number and said, look, would love to meet for a coffee, all the rest of it. And I said, I pretty much just said, look, I'm open for business. Let's do it. And the deal was turned around within 24 hours. But I wasn't to join for another 9 months. So, because I had 9 months to run on my Capital contract. Right, okay. So I think in the old days, they would take you off air. I think before social media, this is something that used to happen in radio back in the day. If you announce you're leaving, or they announce to you that you're leaving, they take you off air until your contract's out because your profile, obviously, they can't have you jump in from one station to the next day. Yeah, but this was before. I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, people are nicer these days. Media companies, obviously, it's a much more, it's not as brutal as it used to be. But with social media and all the rest of it, you're not disappearing because you're not on the radio. So I had 9 months at Capitol as my sort of last sort of parade around the lap around the track, and really enjoyed it. Again, I loved my friends there, and they were really good to me. But it was the right time, so I did 9 months and then joined Clyde, and then the station was the show was networked, so we're on Clyde and Glasgow at the same time as we're on in every other city, and we record bits that go out. And that was it. And that was it's mad. That was I was in Clyde 1, and it was just like a factory. There were so many people about, so many more people, especially in the programming team. And it was just such a buzz. And suddenly I had a producer, and there was programming meetings, whereas before it was just me and the breakfast show. I'd gone from being like a satellite station to being at the network center, and I just coming in every day. There was a canteen, and it was just like, oh, this is amazing.
This is a different world.
Yeah, or at least it was for a few weeks, because then the pandemic hit, and suddenly I was back to having 3 people in the building with me. So,
if you were lucky, you had 3 people.
I know it was wild, wasn't it?
So did Stephen come in initially, or was Stephen then brought in with you after a while? Like, was that the initial idea, was to have you and a co-host, or was it just you yourself then to progress on to having a co-host?
So I was hired on the basis of me.
Right.
It was me that my boss listened to. She'd produced Radio 1 in London, and she came back to bring up her wee boy. So her and her husband moved back, and I think she lived in Falkirk or somewhere. So she'd hear me and then obviously hired me. And that was the show. That was what it was going to be. Big drive show, big competitions, all the rest of it. I'm not like some laugh out loud comedian, not intentionally anyway. So it was just going to be a big, nice drive show, get callers on, all the rest of it. Exactly what I did on Capitol, but with a much wider audience and remit, because the playlist was different and all the rest of it. And we had the chat. I think we met once between me signing and then joining. We'd kept in touch, obviously, because there'd been a couple of things like the papers had got wind of, and it wasn't about me being this big deal. It was just about the changes at Capitol over the course of a year. So that was when the chat happened, where she said, look, what do you need? Stephen, by this point, had gone from being the co-host on the breakfast show at Capitol to reading the news for the new national breakfast show. So he was literally in solitude, basically recording his bulletins. And that obviously wasn't what he wanted to, that wasn't his ambition. So we'd obviously chatted, because we used to be on air with our friend Amy. I've been on air with Stephen throughout so many years, because when I cover breakfast, we'd be on. And we just, clicked on air. I get on with Stephen. We'll annoy each other as much, but I was very business. This wasn't a case of I want my mate on with me. This was a case of he makes the show better. So when we had the chat, we just said, look, let's talk about the show. What do you want? And I said, look, I'll come and do a big drive show. I'll get you an audience. I know that I can do what I do. I said, but if you want to go for gold, if you want me to be a breakfast show in the afternoon, if you want me to give you those big moments, if you want to get awards, if you want to really fucking throw everything at this, you need to give me Stephen. Stephen then by this point was doing weekend stuff. I think he was in the company already. Was he sort of
freelancing at that point?
Yeah, he was doing. I think he had a weekend show, and he was also doing cover for everyone else across the network, and he's also got this other string to his bow, that he's a sports guy, so he was doing reporting shifts on Super Scoreboard and all the rest of it.
Right.
So I really had to sell this, we had to go to Edinburgh and record secret pilots and all the rest of it. Bearing in mind it's 2020, deciding to put 2 guys on together at drive time was a big move. Now, I knew it would work, and I know why it works, because I'm not a typical sort of blokey bloke. Stephen's like your fucking Dunfermline football fan who moans about the price of
everything.
Of soup in the co-op, because he likes his soup with his roll, because that's how he has his soup. Like, Stephen's a typical bloke, and I'm not. So there was never an issue there. We balance everything for that reason. But I just knew that it would work, and fortunately, it started off very light. He wasn't on as much as he is now. You know, he would be on sort of, he does the travel as well, but he'd come in and chip in every so often because we had to take it very slowly. But fortunately, you know, they heard what I hear, and we sort of got left to get on with it.
I think when you listen to yourself and Stephen, the dynamic. I know you touched on it there, but the dynamic just works. It flows. It doesn't seem forced. It just seems.
It's because we're so different. We're so different. I mean, we've got the same values and the same opinions on most things, but we're very different people. Stephen's also, and this is why it works. Stephen's good because I'm good, and vice versa. And or rather, the show's good because he's good, and he's good because I am. And he'd totally agree with that. You know, I'm there behind all the screens. You need that dynamic, that instinct. You know, we know, it sounds so cheesy, but he already knows what I'm looking for him to say, you know, because he's a funny guy. He's good with impressions. He's very cynical, all the rest of it. But it just, as you say, you're not going to get that with everyone. Yeah. I was on air with, and she won't mind me saying this, Kat Harvey, who's, you know, done everything in the media in Scotland. And we've been mates, really good mates for years. And we have nights out I'd never repeat, a fucking riot. And when I was waiting to start at Clyde, I was in the building but not on air yet because I had a non-compete for a few months. They put me on her Sunday morning show to cover for Ewan. So I was on with Kat. And it was just a disaster. I mean, don't get me wrong, we kept the station on air and it was okay, but yeah. I felt so uncomfortable. And she did as well because she knew I was. And what I'm saying is that chemistry you get, I've tried to avoid that word so much, but even with one of your best mates doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work on air. You know, I mean, we've never been on air together since, but that's why with Stephen, it was a case of, no, I don't want to just hang out my buddy here. Yes, we have a proper laugh, but we are grafting every day. And, you know, the stuff that we're doing doesn't just happen either. There's, you know, I've got a group chat I'm in with him that is basically him, where is it? Indoors or outdoors, it's called. Don't ask why. And if I go to it right now, he's put messages on it where I don't know why I've held that up against the lights, but he will message me at midnight saying, I've just seen this for Tayside and Fife, and then I'll see something that's good for Edinburgh because we need to know what's happening in every city. We've got a producer who gives us what we call a regional sheet telling us what the big thing is in that area that day, what gigs are on, all the rest of it. Yeah. But, you know, we like to go a bit further than that. So, yeah, he meets me on graft. He's very good at impressions, and neither of us are competing with each other. If we are going into a link and we're going to talk about something and he knows where I want to get, if he says something funnier before that, bang, I'm into the break. Because, you know, we're not competing to get some punchline or anything like that. I know my role, he knows his.
Yeah, and obviously he certainly knows his role when he asks you the questions on arguably the best game show that there is on radio. Spence versus Shazam became iconic. And
do you know how that came about?
Before you tell me, I'm going to tell you something. You are like an encyclopedia of music because some of the stuff I don't know. I used to do it with dance music, and I'd hear the first kick drum and I'd go, "Yeah, I know what that is." What it could be anything. It could be strings. It could be pads. It could be the tiniest vocal, and
and it's because of here. It's because I've been in this too. I started on air when I was 13, 14, and I had to play older music. So, you know, I've spent 25 years plus just, you know, it's purely as a result of growing up listening to the radio or being on the radio. And that's why you'll hear my most common complaint to him is, that's not the version that was on the radio back in the day, because it's just sort of almost muscle memory. But so I mentioned the non-compete. That means when I came into Clyde in January 2020, for 3 months, I couldn't be on Clyde 1 at the same time as I was on Capital. It's pretty standard in contracts. That's how it goes. But I could be on outside the Central Belt. So we launched that a month after when it was announced the show was going to be syndicated. Yeah. Anyway, I'm hanging about, being paid to do very little, plan the show, right? And I'm in the studio with Stephen, and I'm just sitting back, and I'm like, so Stephen and me used to play when Capital Breakfast had finished at 10 a.m. and we'd linked into the network. He'd fire some tunes at me, and I'd be like, Ting Tings, that's not my name. You know, Prince, Raspberry Beret, whatever it was. Yeah. And he started doing this in the Clyde studio because we're both just kicking about. And then every so often, like one of the bosses, David, the content director, would pop his head in, go, all right, everything all right? Stephen's like, oh, here, you got to hear this. Wait, you see this. And it became some sort of like freak show, some circus freak show where whoever was passing by, come and hear this thing he does. So it came about as a result, which I think all the best ideas do, of us fanning about in the studio. And he's like, do you know what? This has got to be a feature on air. It's such a useless skill, but it's mental. So, and then I think at the start we did 4 songs and it just sort of evolved from there. I genuinely get asked about it as much as the cash register. I got a message. I got it like on the 27th of December. I was on Facebook Messenger, and because I do a Saturday night dance show that doesn't go out in Glasgow, and that's where people get in touch.
I wonder why that is. I think there's another dance
because
show
Clyde management aren't mental, right? Again, I don't know if you heard the documentary for George's 25th on Breakfast, but like there's nobody wants to take over from George on either show.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So anyway, that's where people get in touch with song requests or to ask about a song I've played, because I play loads of old school dance that doesn't get played anymore. And I get this message on the 27th saying, just to let you know, Spence versus Shazam was brought up. This was somebody that I think they were in Perth, a listener in Perth. Spence versus Shazam was brought up at Christmas dinner 2 days ago and resulted in a full-on family argument. Just like, and don't get me wrong, sorry there was an argument, but that's why we just thought we got to get this feature on air, because you don't often get a feature that's got that, what we call in radio, cut through, that sort of recall. When I was doing my Christmas party run at Doubletree in Hilton, like 1,000 people every night, and it's the only thing they would mention,
Yeah,
so we're very lucky.
Yeah, because you say that there, I speak to George and Cassie, and they'll say the same thing. When it used to be the 5K minute, they would go to gigs and people would come up to them and say to them, "When you get me on the 5K minute." So you've got your 5K minute with Spence versus Shazam, and I listen to it pretty much religiously every day, because I'm going to pick the missus up from work, and the show's on, and I listen to it religiously. And I always think to myself, when you get to like, if it gets to 2-0 to Shazam, and I think to myself, oh,
no, totally.
No, I think. Oh,
well, we're shitting ourselves for 2 reasons.
What's going to happen here if that goes to the 3 and then 4? Oh no,
because I think it was about a year ago the game ended forever, but obviously it couldn't. We were bringing it back, but but it's totally legit. It's totally genuine. And a lot of people still don't believe that, and we filmed it and everything. But again, you can't prove, even if you film it, that you're not seeing the song. I'm not that good an actor.
So we'll talk about one last thing before I let you go, because I know that you're a busy man and you will be on air this afternoon. Now is a different kind of kettle of fish. You're now making the super jackpot call, but before you got to make the best call in radio when you made the cash register call. Now obviously we had spoken about the woman Mary who made headlines, and her call with you was so inspirational, and it really did touch. And I know it won am I right in saying it won an award for down at the
it got the Radio Times Moment of the Year nomination, and it was funny, we were in London at the awards. Adele Roberts is on Radio 1. She'd been going through a cancer treatment, and Adele was a friend of mine. She used to cover me on Galaxy. That's how mad it was. And she's just such a cliche, but a nicer person in this business you will not meet. You just want to look after her, and that was before she got ill. And she was nominated for how she talked about her first day back at Radio 1 after her treatment. And I genuinely think I must have been the only person in the history of any award ceremony who's sitting there shitting themselves they might win, because I knew the call was good, but also we were promoting, it was a vote-based thing. And it was going out on all the Scottish stations. They were promoting it. They were plugging it to hell, vote at the Radio Times website, all the rest of it. So I thought the collective sort of Scottish vote might do it. And I was because she's so loved by everyone. And we're in this big room in the Adelphi in London. There's like 1,000 radio people there. And I was genuinely scared about having to get up there, because, I was happy that Adele was better. I was so happy that she won it. But yeah, we got silver. And, yeah, you're right. The call with Mary was I remember saying to my boss off air, I was doing, so the call goes out 2 minutes after it's made. It's in a delay because of swearing, because of this and that.
Absolutely, of course, yeah.
And I said, just as it was going out, I messaged my boss and said, I think I've just put out the greatest call I've ever put out, because it was a sad story, but it was also a happy story. And I knew it would impact people, which is why we love radio and why we got into it. However, 2 days before this.
Yeah, I know where we're going to go with this one.
one of my favorite contestants we have ever had. I remember she was just like, if you had to design a Scottish gran who'd grafted all her days, who brought up her wains, who took no shit, you'd be over the back of her fucking knees. True. I honestly, if it wasn't for Mary, your gran was the superstar of the year.
I know.
So for anyone who missed it, and I didn't know this till after, Stephen's gran came on, and she was just like everything I've just described, and she was so dry. She talked about, is it bridge club she goes to?
No, she goes line dancing on a Monday, and line dancing on a Thursday.
I said, you'll be able to. How much did she win?
40,000.
I said to her, you'll be able to tell everyone at line dancing. She said, aye, they'll be all over me like snakes, and she was just laugh out loud funny. People just loved her, and obviously, again, there was a call coming 2 days later that I didn't know about. But how is she? Is she all right?
She's good, mate. She's good. She's lapping it up. She's 40 grand better off. She's loving life.
That's just over a year now, isn't it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, just when it was. It was just about maybe about 14, 15 months ago now. But yeah, she's loving life, and obviously she was dead excited because she's got her back on after it, and she was coming back on the radio, and she knows that the radio is where I want to be eventually, and she was just so happy to be on and be able to talk to me about it, and it was
your gran made it to Clyde one before you, Macca.
This is true, mate, and that's scary, and it's harrowing. But I would never take it away from her. And she obviously, I was the only one that got mentioned in the call. My dad didn't get a mention. Nobody else got a mention apart from her grandson, which was me. And I was praying to God nobody knew who she was talking about, because I'm thinking to myself, oh, please God, don't let
you're gonna get tapped up for so much money.
Please God, don't let him know what this is. But then everybody it all caught on, and I was getting umpteen messages, and it was a really great thing. And you and Stephen were brilliant with her, but she was just so happy to be on the radio.
It's an incredible thing to get to do. And do you know what I've learned most about that competition? So I get asked a lot about it. It's obviously exciting that I don't know who I'm going to get at the other end.
Yeah.
But I've realized it's not about the amount of money. It's really, truly not. Evidenced by somebody who came on who won 150 grand, and you'd have thought I just pissed in her slippers.
Yeah.
And I always say, not everyone's a screamer. Not everyone's got that in them. But sometimes you're a bit like, come on. You can be grateful without screaming. But there was a girl who came in yesterday to Clyde one in Glasgow, and she brought us in a hamper, and she had won on the super jackpot.
Yeah, that's right. I was listening to that yesterday.
Right. So anyway, she gave us a really nice note. I won't go into detail with it, given that I've now, just identified her. But she had a pretty hellish time over the last few years, and she won 12 grand. Now, again, in cash register terms, super jackpot terms, this sounds wild to say that's not the biggest amount of money. Of course it is. Who wouldn't take 12 grand tomorrow? I know I would.
Yeah, exactly.
But she wrote me the most beautiful, she was just, I could see what it meant, and it was really quite emotional, and it just goes to show, because she was saying that people are saying to her, oh, shame it wasn't the week when it was 110 grand. It didn't matter. It was enough for her to, as she put it, hit reset and get on with it. And for that reason, it obviously goes without saying, it is the greatest job in the world,
Do you find that very humbling, and you actually probably appreciate what the difference you're making in other? I mean, you maybe don't think about it beforehand, but then when it actually comes to the forefront and you're getting, as you say, these notes and people coming in saying, oh, this has changed my life, and as you say, be able to reset, it must be very humbling to be able to give these people a little smidgen, just a little bit back.
Yeah, excuse me, it's not my money. It's absolutely, it's not my money, and it's a game, and it's on the radio. But the thing that people always say about radio, and this is why I'm so proud of my industry, no more so than during the pandemic, and it happened more during the pandemic than ever. People would get in touch with you and say, oh, you really got me through this shit day or this shit time. And when I was in Capital for so long, I think my last week at Capital, not my last day, somebody got in touch who, without going into detail, had listened to me in Livingston when they were 12, and they were really having, they had an awful childhood.
Yeah.
And they now had their own business. That next thing. Really successful, turned their life right. It made me feel old for a start, because they'd done all this and now they were in their bloody mid-20s. But people always tell you what a difference radios made to them and how much you'd helped them through this, through that, the radio station, you know, and stuff you might have done on air. People never consider that it's absolutely, and this is the beauty of it, it's a two-way thing, you know, because we're humans, we have lives going on, we have good days, bad times in life. And when you do, there was one day I was really, really, really stressed about something, and I was on air, and I was actually waiting for the result of a test, in case I make it sound worse than it was, which fortunately wasn't, you know, what it could have been. And I was really quite, you know, just
as you would be
miserable, and I had a cash register call that day, and so to answer your question, and they were amazing, and they were, and it just, my point is, it's not just a one-way thing. Listeners get you through stuff without even realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. So before I let you go, just the last thing, what's next for Garry Spence? Have you still got things that you want to achieve? Have you still got things you want to do, or are you, you know, are you satisfied with everything that you've achieved so far?
I've got absolutely no outstanding ambitions. I really don't, and I feel so lucky to be saying that. I'm so lucky. This is the station I grew up in, literally grew up in.
Yeah.
And 3 years ago, I was back on it as part of a syndicated show. When I was sitting here when I was 18, I wanted to do the drive time show on MFR in the north of Scotland. Better still, do it in Aberdeen or Dundee or Edinburgh or Glasgow. Again, Glasgow is just, Clyde always intimidated me. And so I was scared of Glasgow in a way. I just thought it was too big. Just, nah, not for me. And, you know, all these years later, I'm not only on drive time here, but I'm on it at Clyde. I still have moments where, especially being up here, that's probably why I've rambled quite a bit with this chat, because I feel very sentimental and nostalgic generally, but being up here in my home sort of studio, if you like, I feel very lucky. I wouldn't, if I could freeze now for the next 20 years, like,
you'd be happy.
Yeah, you get like people say, oh, you know, what about, you know, and this makes me feel old, radio tour that, and I just think you've got to manage your expectations, and basically,
I don't think you're quite there yet.
Just don't, but even still, don't push your fucking luck. You know what I mean? I've got 3 healthy kids, you know, wife, everything's, you know, got my little house. Don't ask for too much. I've already been given so much more than I would have asked for.
Yeah, definitely, mate. Listen, Garry, I'm really humbled that you've took the time out of your busy schedule to come on and talk to me today.
I don't daft any time.
And the fact that you've been so open about everything it means a lot to me, and obviously it gives the listeners the chance to hear your story and how everything came about. So, when the needle drops, listeners, thank you very much again for listening, and I will see you next time. This has been Maka, and my guest today, Clyde One's drive time specialist, Mr. Garry Spence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, pal. See you soon.
Cheers, mate.